There are about people in the waiting room that are going to be watching. So, just in case. Good evening. My name is Brother Patrick Conway, and I serve as the Vice President for Mission and Identity here at Christian Brothers University. My understanding is there's about 30 people in the waiting room that are going to be viewing this online. And so I'd like to welcome all of you as well as those people here in the auditorium. On behalf of President James Shannon, our president here at Christian Brothers University, I'd like to welcome you. And I'd like to thank Father Carmen Neely for making this opportunity available to us to hear Bishop Stowe. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Father Mealy, who will in turn introduce Bishop Stowe.
Thank you, Brother Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here. We don't have a big audience, but yes, we're filling up a little bit, and we know there are quite a few people on Zoom looking in. I want to begin just by talking a little bit and just say a few words about the St. Martin de Porres National Shrine and Institute, and then I'll introduce Bishop John Stowe. The St. Martin de Porres Shrine was instituted in 1936 in the city of Columbia, South Carolina, where it to African American people there. When we formed the new Southern Dominican province, actually 16 years after it was formed in 1980, the shrine was moved to New Orleans, the seat of our province. And then in 2001, it was moved to a permanent site here in Memphis. Since that time, it has hosted a number of cultural and social events. This last couple of years that I've been associated with the Shrine and Institute, we have had catechesis and now in the thrust of at evangelization and also the justice lecture, and we hope to have a medical ethics lecture. In 2015, the shrine was given a national status. So now the official name is the St. Martin de Porres National Shrine and Institute. Bishop John Stowe was born in Amherst, Ohio. I believe that's in the Cleveland area in 1966. He went to a Franciscan parish and the parish school, and then after high school and year of community college, he Franciscans. He was ordained in El Paso, Texas in 1996, or 1995. Were you were you ordained in El Paso too? He was ordained in Lorain, but he was working at had the fortune of meeting him not too long after that in 1998. In 2010, he moved from El Paso to Cary, Ohio, where he became the rector of Our Lady of Consolation Basilica and Shrine. And then in 2015, Pope Francis asked him to become the Bishop of Lexington. And I want to kind of give you a sense of who John Stowe is by Pope Francis's request that he become Bishop of Lexington. Evidently, the Apostolic Nuncio to the United States called Bishop John while he was well, he was the rector of the shrine, and told him that asked him if he would be of Lexington, and Bishop John responded that He loves Pope Francis, and he would do anything that Pope Francis asks. Now, it's a nice little story, the allegiance of a priest to the Pope, but I think it says more than that. He loves Pope Francis because Pope Francis, as anyone, follows Saint Francis of Assisi. And John has a Francis of Assisi. Indeed, he's a Franciscan priest. And I think we can farther. What was Saint Francis of Assisi, if not another Christ? So it's Christ whom John follows, whom we follow, but we have successors, Pope Francis and Saint Francis, who help us to be more faithful Christians. To present to you Bishop John Stowe, the Bishop of Lexington, for Pope Francis, crisis, and what Christians should know and do about it.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here. And greetings to everybody out there in Zoom land. There are more of you than there are us here in the auditorium, but it's great to be with you all. I'm honored to be giving the social justice lecture for the National Shrine of St. Martin de Porres. And I recall that I was first introduced to the Sixth Dominican brother by my fourth grade teacher, Sister Casilda, who had the habit of reading us a story about a saint each afternoon as we returned from lunch. I don't know her sources, but she told us that Martin was so gentle with animals and with all creation that he would pray in the evening out in the woods in order to. Now, as you can imagine, that made quite an impression on a fourth grader, even if it wasn't an act of charity that I was eager to imitate. Later, as I discovered that Martin was a religious brother, I realized we're at Christian Brothers University tonight, I realized how many of the religious men who influenced me were brothers who often worked behind the scenes, were never in the pulpit or getting much recognition, but quiet. It's remarkable that of all the Dominicans in Lima at their time, it was the humble porter, Martin, that everyone knew by name and knew their story, along with the tertiary Dominican sister, Rose of Lima, who become the universal saints recognized by the entire church. Father Carmen mentioned the time that we were together in El Paso, Texas. So during the 15 years that I lived on the US-Mexico border there, some of them with Father Carmen, the Isleta Mission, the oldest church in Texas where we live, old statue of Martin de Porres with an actual broom in his hand, symbolic of the humble tasks that Martin performed, and naturally he was surrounded by his beloved animals. And periodically, when I would go over to the mission church to celebrate the 7 a.m. Mass, I would notice that the broom was missing. And I learned from the Mexican people there about a custom of stealing Martin's broom for ransom when praying for a special favor from him. Answer my prayer if you ever want to see your broom again. Now, this past summer, in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, many parishes named across the country in the African American communities became places of gathering, reflection, and debate about the kind of changes needed in our society. And one Martin de Porres parish is nearby Louisville, Kentucky. And would you believe I was invited this year to share in the annual Marco de Porres Social Justice Lecture at Creighton University this fall about faithful citizenship. That lecture, Marco de Porres, was named for our saint and for a Creighton Jesuit who had started an organization in Omaha for Black Catholics. So maybe Martin de Porres is trying to tell me something. And actually, I think that that something is to see in his story embodies in his life story the beautiful and hope-filled vision of redeemed humanity that Pope Francis describes in his Fratelli Tutti, in which he calls us to transcend differences like race and nationality, political persuasion, and economic status, and to recognize that we really are brothers and sisters to each other and to all of creation, something St. Martin was already witnessing in Lima with all creatures centuries ago. Now, tonight I'm going to speak about two of the three encyclicals written by Pope Francis. The other was his first, and it was a completion of an encyclical started by Pope Benedict XVI, and Francis described it as written with four hands, Lumen Fide. But I'm going to talk about the other two encyclicals, and when I finish these remarks, we'll open it up for questions, comments, which can be given from those of you on Zoom, either by unmuting your microphone at the time, and we'll have someone here making sure that we can all hear you, or by using the chat feature on the Zoom connection, and we'll have someone here read that question aloud. But I'm going to talk about two of those three encyclicals, which in Latin encyclicals come from the opening words. They take their names from the writings of Francis of Assisi, the Pope's own namesake. One, Laudato Si, is described as a plea for the world to recognize the interconnectedness of all creation and work together to protect what the Pope describes as our common home. The other encyclical, released barely 2 months ago, is called Fratelli Tutti and calls for humanity to come together in this time of pandemic and reconsider the world order from the perspective of human family. And finally, I'll spend a bit of time considering Amazon, which I think is the real bridge between these encyclicals and provides a case study for the vision of Pope Francis of a redeemed humanity and a renewed church, even beyond the terms of. So this year called for a Laudato Si year, marking the 5th anniversary of the publication of this environmental encyclical. 15. It was received then by the media as something controversial, which the media loves, and the media characterized the Pope as wading into the waters of climate change, wading into the political change. Well, actually, Pope Benedict XVI had beat Pope Francis into those waters and had already affirmed the reality of climate change and the role of human participation in it. But Pope Francis was first to compose an entire encyclical on the issue of the environment, and therefore to include Christian and human responsibility to protect and care for the environment as a matter of doctrine, as a matter of the Church's teaching. I think Pope Francis's contribution to the social doctrine of the Church overall is his center. He's putting it at the heart people might be interested in, but as something essential to the. As he has constantly done throughout his pontificate, Francis sheds light on the perspective of the marginalized, brings their voice to the table. His words in Laudato Si carried a frankness and an unusual for papal encyclicals. Yet it was at the same time clearly a pastoral document which brings together areas of faith, spirituality, activism, science, and pastoral care as he addresses the human dimensions of the ecological crisis. Starting with the original meaning of the word ecology, Pope Francis refers to the earth as home, our common home. And he quotes Francis of Assisi's familial terminology of sister, Mother Earth. He says, our sister is hurting, has been calling out. Human sin and violence are manifest in the abuse of soil, water, air, and forms of life. We have forgotten that Genesis teaches us we're made of the earth. He cites his predecessor's concern with the environment, going back to St. John the 23rd, and he lists the company of scientists, philosophers, theologians, and civic groups among those who recognize the severity of the. And he quotes his good friend, Patriarch Bartholomew, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the leader of the Orthodox Church, who has called crimes against the natural world, quote, sins against ourselves and against God. Now, Pope Francis does not claim to be original and vulnerable to the plight of the planet. He draws upon the example of his namesake, Francis of Assisi, who lived joyfully and authentically while caring for the outcast and living in fraternity with all creation, gives him the model. St. Francis was in love with creatures and teaches us an openness to awe and wonder at God's creation, while giving an example of how life should be lived in relationships of fraternity rather than structures of dominance. The Pope appeals for change for the whole, to seek sustainable and integral development. He laments that ecological preservation efforts have been met with powerful opposition and indifference or denial, or with a blind confidence in merely technical solutions. Technical solutions, he says, can never suffice for a multifaceted problem that is a spiritual challenge as well as a scientific one. In the encyclical, the Pope reviews the scientific research, which is not a standard feature in encyclicals, together with the principles of Judeo the environment. He presents the roots and causes humanly and relationally, and makes proposals for dialogue and international policy, which includes guidelines for education and human spiritual development. Throughout the encyclical, a connection between the poor and the fragility of the planet, the interconnectedness of everything, critiques of power, and the proposal of a new lifestyle will surface repeatedly. Something also found in the pastoral letters that were issued by the bishops of the Appalachian region, which was my first opening to the place that I was asked to be bishop of in 2015. The first chapter of Laudato Si describes what is happening to our common home. And the Pope notes that theological and philosophical reflections are tiresome and abstract when not grounded in a real analysis of the situation. He describes, and this is a difficult word to pronounce, a rapidification, making things more rapidly, a rapidification, one of his invented words, or excessive acceleration of the crisis, which he says is rooted in what he calls an irrational confidence in progress. And as he describes the conditions of pollution and climate change, he says he does not so much want to inform as to raise concern about the gravity of the situation, saying that the earth is looking more and more like, quote, an immense pile of filth. Rubbish is the product of throwaway culture. Most papers not recycled. We've become accustomed to the opposite of the natural ecosystems in which plants synthesize nutrients, which feed herbivores, and those produce organic waste that gives rise to new plants. Industrialization has not developed limitations on the use of non-renewable resources, nor has it promoted the maximization of recycling, of throwaway culture. Climate change disproportionately affects the poor who depend on agriculture, fishing, and forestry. Plants and animals change, affecting the populations dependent on those plants and animals, adding to the human phenomenon of migration, while there's widespread indifference to the suffering of migrant and refugee populations. As the Pope describes the importance of water, he notes that the poor have more experience with unsafe water and the diseases which accompany it, dysentery and cholera, as well as detergents and chemicals which pollute natural water sources. Meanwhile, clean water is becoming privatized, a marketable commodity. The Pope says that the world has a social debt towards the poor who lack access to drinking water. Again, I can bring that home to my own diocese, where one of our counties has not had public water that is drinkable for almost a decade now. Despite the federal government and state governments putting money into that system, it's all been used by other political projects and not produced the clean drink needs. We've all heard about Flint, Michigan, and the challenges and problems there. In Appalachian Kentucky, it's because of the pollution that came from coal mining and dumping the refuse into the water. So this is a global phenomenon that comes very close to us. Even if we live in privileged areas, we may not see it affect us quite so directly. Pope Francis decries the loss of forests and woodlands means the loss of species and more extinctions. He says a sober look shows that the degree of human intervention, often in the service of business interests and consumerism, is making our earth less rich and beautiful. And there's no way, he says, that artificial products can compete with natural beauty. Even when aware of the impact on soil, water, and air, the impact on biodiversity is rarely studied, often overlooked. And this happens with the constructions of roads, plantations, and even the commercial exploitation of certain species without attention to the imbalance created. There are extremely high costs to environmental deterioration not seen by those trying to make a quick profit. And we might add, also for making quick political gains, like all and the ecological concerns that it has, or the Dakota. The Pope discusses how humans are affected by environmental destruction. Without green spaces affects human quality of life. Spaces have become increasingly privatized, and the growth of the past 2 centuries has not always led to improvement of life, but often to more social exclusion, inequitable distribution and consumption of energy, social breakdown, increased violence and social aggression, drug use, and the loss of identity. The omnipresence of media and the digital world is and the capacity to think deeply, not so easy with so much noise and so much distraction, pollution. And Francis speaks controversially of an ecological debt between North and South. We always think about debt coming from the ecological debt that the North owes the South based on commercial imbalances and the disproportional use of resources. Warming that results from overconsumption by the developed world on the developing world. Corporations pollute in poorer countries in ways they would never get away with in richer countries. Or I can say again, from an Appalachian perspective, in poorer parts of richer countries where they can get away with it. Poorer countries fuel the development of richer countries, yet are controlled by foreign debt. Francis says we need to strengthen the conviction that we are one human family. Fears or barriers, political or social, behind which we can hide. Still less is there room for the globalization of indifference. In contrast with that grim description of degradation, Pope Francis offers a of creation. All creation is linked by unseen bonds in a universal family, which neither limits the uniqueness of human beings nor divinizes the earth itself. two trends in the compatible with Christianity, talking about nature and diminishing the role of humans, or speak it in its totality is God. But we cannot have communion with all creation if we lack tenderness and compassion for our fellow human beings. To universal communion exclude nothing and no one. Peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are entirely interconnected. The Pope notes that even unbelievers recognize the earth as a shared inheritance whose fruit not an absolute right, but also that private property has a social mortgage. That message didn't always come across from his fans in the United States. Rappidification described earlier is advanced by technology and the globalization paradigm. Earlier intervention in nature respect receiving what nature itself allowed. Now the tendency is to extract everything possible from nature in the service of unlimited growth, limited supply of the earth's goods. Even the claims that technology will solve all problems and that market growth will resolve hunger and poverty are made without interest in balanced levels of production, better distribution of wealth, or concern for the environment or the rights of future generations. Technology also promotes specialization, which to see a bigger picture. A broader vision is needed, which includes policies, educational programs, lifestyle changes, and spirituality, so that human existence is not reduced to a technocratic paradigm. Nobody's suggesting, the Pope says, a return to the Stone Age, but we do need to slow down in a different way to appropriate the positive and sustainable progress which has been made, but also to recover the values and the great goals swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur. When he says that, the Pope then looks at some of the native populations of the world that the Western world and shows their own example of living in harmony with nature, knowing how to borrow and to use and to replace the things that are used. And those that we easily dismiss as primitive may have something to teach us in our advanced way of life. Describing further imbalances while also responding to some critics of the Judeo-Christian tradition and its role in the destruction of the environment, the Pope acknowledges that modernity is marked by an excessive anthropomorphism, anthropocentrism, an excessive focus on the human being. The dominion over the earth from our scriptural tradition has to be understood as responsible stewardship, not as a right to exploit. At the same time, he reasserts the special role of humanity within creation. When we don't acknowledge the worth of a poor person or a person with disabilities, we certainly won't hear the cry of nature itself. The environment can never be isolated from our relationship with others because everything is interrelated. An exaggerated anthropocentrism, exaggerated emphasis on humanity requires that everything serves one's immediate interests. Everything else becomes relative. Even human trafficking, drug and the slave trade, commerce in blood diamonds, in endangered species all become possible. He says doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony or disdain. We may well be leaving to coming generations debris, desolation, and filth. The pace of consumption, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes that periodically occur in different areas of the world. The effects of the present imbalance can only be reduced by our decisive action here and now. We need to reflect on our accountability before those who will have to endure the dire consequences. Rampant individualism, the self-centered culture of instant gratification makes it very difficult to address the environmental challenge. And so the encyclical Laudato Si is a call to conversion, not just individual and communal conversion, but a global conversion to a sustainable lifestyle lived in interrelationship with all humanity and all creation. The encyclical is also indisputably a call to action. The Pope explicitly calls for an international dialogue recognizing global interdependence. The consensus needed for planning sustainable and diversified agriculture, sustainable and less polluting sources of energy, more efficient use of energy, better management of marine and forest resources, as basic as drinking water, are much bigger than national concerns. Highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, needs to be progressively replaced and without delay. Short-term solutions, seen as the lesser of two evils, can be legitimate temporarily, as long as we're on the way to a necessary transition. No real progress interests are more powerful than the common good. And we can't even agree on national interests because we're stuck on partisan interests. Pope Francis says we can't ask the poor to pay for the solutions caused by industrial giants. Enforceable international agreements are necessary. Therefore, a true world political authority is urgently needed. And here he cites Benedict XVI. Proposed changes cannot be myopic or designed only for the length of a political term in office. Processes are important because there are no quick solutions. Transparency is important to overcome special interests and corruption. The Pope addresses the oft-stated concern about the Church's involvement in these issues. Quote, "The Church does not presume to settle scientific questions or to replace politics. But I am concerned to encourage an honest and open debate so that particular interests or ideologies will not prejudice the common good. Market solutions will not be sufficient. Science alone will not be sufficient because science doesn't respond to all the issues of meaning for humanity. Science and religion should be in dialogue. And the Church's greatest contribution can be in the promotion of ecological education and the spirituality needed to transform the. And that's hard for us in this country. He points out an inherent irony with people who have totally accepted view and are also working for environmental improvement. The marketing of a better ecology, buy more ecologically responsible. Education should lead people to grow in solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care. Committed individuals cannot do this alone. And then this past October 3rd, after celebrating a simple mass at the tomb of St. Francis, Pope Francis signed his latest encyclical, Laudato Si, emphasizing humanity's role and the need for an understanding of the interrelatedness of human beings as well as of all. And so this first Jesuit Pope has surprised many of Franciscan spirituality and his preaching of a Franciscan message. He has made several trips to Assisi, and each time there he finds an inspiration for his ministry to the global church. He tells us that he chose the name Francis because as the ballots of the conclave were being counted, and those who were keeping track realized that he had reached a sufficient number to be elected Pope, a fellow South American cardinal, the Franciscan Claudio Humes from Brazil, grabbed his arm and told him, "Don't forget about the poor." It was at that moment that the name came to him. When he had been advised earlier to start selecting a name, he was considering John the 24th. Francis of Assisi may be more popularly known for his love of animals, but the basis of his spirituality is the incarnation, God becoming one with God's creation by becoming human like us. Francis of Assisi's devotion was to Christ, the Christ of the incarnation, at Bethlehem, at Calvary, and prolonged in the celebration of the Eucharist. Francis even addressed the Virgin Mary as she who gave the creator of the world to us as a brother. It is this brotherhood, this fraternity, that the human family has to learn again if we are to face the challenges of our time and the bigger ones ahead. The Pope says in this encyclical that his original plan was to write the encyclical on the theme of interreligious dialogue. And he wanted, in that case, to build on the 1219 encounter between Francis of Assisi and the Sultan al-Malik in Egypt during the time of the Crusades. Pope Francis wished to build on the goodwill and the common interest in human rights, which he expressed with the chief imam in Saudi Arabia. In the early paragraphs of this document, the Pope says that it was the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic that inspired a broader message. It seems that Pope Francis sees the pandemic as a serious dress rehearsal before major ecological crises affect us. And if we can't address the challenges of the pandemic together, there's not much hope for humanity. But since hopelessness is incompatible with the Christian message and unacceptable to Francis, he proposes the way of fraternity, brotherhood and sisterhood, as the way forward. Like the beginning of Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti paints a disturbing picture. In each of these encyclicals, Francis avoids sugarcoating the reality and using highly theoretical or philosophical language. The first chapter of Fratelli Tutti is called Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. And here he describes what he had earlier described as the globalization of indifference. He laments that with globalization, we become neighbors without becoming neighborly, much less recognizing each other as brothers and sisters. He describes some of humanity's steps backwards, whether it's the lack of cohesion in the European Union, or the partisan or racial divisions in the United States, or the refusal to even acknowledge the values of other cultures around the globe. In a phrase that made me wonder whether the Pope had seen too many 2020 US election commercials, he said, quote, "The spread of despair, hyperbole, extremism, and polarization, strategies of ridicule, suspicion, and relentless criticism denies the rights of others to exist or even have an opinion. This leads to a permanent state of disagreement, and victory consists not so much in winning as in eliminating one's opponents." And in this encyclical, he also describes that throwaway culture that results in throwaway lives, especially the unborn and the elderly. He acknowledged that the abandonment of the elderly preceded the pandemic, but has been intensified and very clearly on display during it. The benefits of science and technology are undeniable, but they haven't prevented moral deterioration and the weakening of spiritual values. He says, we can discover faraway planets, but not see the needs of our brothers and sisters orbiting around us. The same concern for the peripheries, for those on the margins, is described as in the previous encyclical. The Pope says that the virus momentarily revived the sense of our global community, but we forget way too soon. He describes the competition for the greater consumption at a level the planet cannot sustain, and the divisions and violence that results because only a few can actually achieve that standard of living and that kind of wealth. Even the advances in social media have not made us more neighborly, but allow us to dismiss and ignore people, quote, while shamelessly peering into every detail of their lives. As bleak as that picture is, The Pope reminds us that we already have an alternative, the alternative proposed by Jesus. The seeds of his goodness are already sown. For example, those who have selflessly sacrificed their health to serve others during this pandemic. There are those signs around us. The Pope goes on to tell the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan, reminding that the parable was told in response to the question, who is my neighbor? And he emphasizes the Samaritan's foreignness, the Samaritan's lack of standing in Israelite society, but his willingness to help the one in need while the religious walk by. He also notes that the Samaritan couldn't do it all by himself. He needed the help of the innkeeper. Acting neighborly can help us see that we are brothers and sisters, and what we need to repair our broken world is to follow the example of the Good Samaritan. And he suggests that if we don't follow the example of the Good Samaritan, then we either identify with the company of robbers or the indifferent who walk by. The Pope then proposes charity and social friendship. This, in contrast, he says, to the virus of racism that quietly mutates, goes into hiding, and lurks in waiting. Solidarity, he suggests, is the result of conversion, not the accumulation of random acts of generosity. Solidarity requires thinking of us rather than us and them. The emphasis of conversion is another point of convergence with the earlier environmental encyclical. We have to decide to change to make the world better. Francis even talks about the possibility of political charity. Political charity sounds almost laughable to our ears, but he gives a very simple example that makes it believable. Helping an elderly person to get across a river can be an act of charity. Building a bridge for many people to cross the river safely is an act of political charity. Lamenting that politics has become a bad word, he reminds us that it can be a noble vocation, especially if one uses access to power to promote human dignity, to promote the common good, the basic ingredients of Catholic social teaching. That is how our faith should. As much as Francis can and does appeal to reason to make his case, he knows that it's more important to reach hearts than minds. Conversion of heart is necessary to save the planet. Conversion of heart is necessary for global cooperation. We need hearts open to the whole world and need to discover the importance of real encounter and real friendship to begin this process of transforming the world. The Pope has emphasized the importance of a genuine encounter with the other, not through technology that can be turned on and off, ever since the beginning of his papacy. And he's likewise called for a revolution of tenderness to counteract the globalization of indifference. From this kind of personal interaction, the culture expands to include the role of the United Nations, to create structures that supersede nations, to realities like migration and climate change. And he calls upon all the religions of the world, not just ours, all the religions of the world, to engage in dialogue and teach the rest of humanity about the common good and our common origin as children of God. These primary values of creation as God's revelation and redemption through fraternity came together in the experience and the results of the Amazon Synod. From the night of his election as Pope, when Francis called himself the Bishop of Rome who came from the ends of the earth, Francis has tried to exemplify this fraternity among bishops and not exercise authority only above them. He has re-energized the process of the Synod, the gathering that was restored at the Second Vatican Council, and has described synodality as the way forward, which he succinctly defines as walking together. Synodality involves true listening and speaking the truth. Just as he instructed the participants at the opening of the Synod on the Family, Don't leave here and then whine because the results were not what you wanted. Participate by speaking boldly and listening charitably. We know it's not easy to do both simultaneously. While the US and Western European media focused on the two proposals from the working document of the Synod for the Amazon, that is, the suggestion of ordaining older married men as priests for the celebration of the Eucharist and the ordaining of women to the diaconate for pastoral ministry, they missed the main concerns that led Pope Francis to call the Synod together, which were to discern God's will for the evangelization and sustained community life of these indigenous communities and the preservation of the environment in the Amazon, which is considered the lungs of our planet. Not enough attention was paid to the calls for enculturated liturgy, for greater appreciation for cultures considered primitive or even backward by a great portion of the world, and the importance of learning from these cultures the way of living in harmony with the natural environment rather than exploiting it. In his apostolic exhortation, Caritas in Veritate, he says, in a cultural reality like the Amazon region, where there is such a close relationship between human beings and nature, daily existence is always cosmic. Setting others free from their forms of bondage surely involves caring for the environment and defending it, but even more, helping the human heart to be open and with trust to the God who not only has created all that exists, but has also given himself in Jesus Christ. The Lord, who is first to care for us, teaches us to care for our brothers and sisters and the environment which he daily gives us. This is the first ecology that we need. I cited that source incorrectly. It's from Amazonia Querida, which includes a quotation from Caritas in Veritate. The Holy Father describes the Amazonian way of living as a cosmic mysticism. He finds the harmony with creation that Francis of Assisi experienced from his life of conversion, and he finds there answers to our present-day problems. As the Amazonians realize, to abuse nature is to abuse our ancestors, our brothers and sisters, creation and the Creator, and to mortgage the future. Within the necessary conversion required to stop the destruction of the region and its peoples, within the context of considering conversion necessary to stop the destruction of the Amazon region, the Pope described his dreams. One, for the rights of the poor, with their voices to be heard and dignity advanced. Two, preservation of distinctive cultural riches. Three, jealous preservation of natural beauty and superabundant life in rivers and forests. And four, Christian communities with Amazonian features capable of generous commitment. This demonstrates the remarkable consistency of Francis. He's never exclusively concerned about the church looking in on itself. He's always concerned about the church's interaction with the world and with the people on the peripheries whose experience could be exploited for the agenda of other parts of the church. He always presents a holistic approach of seeing the bigger picture. It is significant that the issues of the ordination of married men and women deacons were openly discussed, part of the synodal process, walking together that requires a synodal church, a listening church. It's also significant that in answering questions in the aftermath of the synod about why these proposals were neither accepted nor formally rejected, the Pope explains that the participants still need to learn the difference between a synod and a parliament. He said, since there were only two divided parties in relationship to these two questions, and both parties challenged or modified and came out exactly as they went in, he did not discern the Holy Spirit providing a path forward. It requires further discernment. As we've all seen, Pope Francis knows that few people will read an encyclical. He knows that actions speak louder than words. Pope is a masterful teacher through gestures. From the earliest days of his papacy, which included the washing of prisoners' feet on Holy Thursday, to his voyage to Lampedusa to celebrate Mass on an altar constructed with the wood of a shipwreck in which hundreds of migrants died, to the everyday smiles, and his Mercy Friday surprise visits to the suffering in many contexts. Perhaps the most striking of his gestures and the most fitting for our present moment, Eucharistic adoration in a rainy St. Peter's Square, with the Pope practically alone, but addressing a scared, suffering, and safely distant global humanity. As he compared the situation to Jesus asleep in the apostles' boat, which was beginning to sink in a storm, he appealed to the calming presence of Christ to carry us through this pandemic. But he also offered the admonition about how foolish to think that we could remain healthy in a sick world. May we learn the interconnectedness of all creation. May we learn the gifts, the beauty of fraternity, the interconnectedness of the human family. And may we find the way forward to that fraternal world that ushers in the reign of God. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we can accept some questions or comments from those in Zoom land and those here in the auditorium at Christian Brothers University. If I didn't exhaust you entirely. See Leo?
Yes. Bishop, thank you so much for your remarks tonight. They were very encouraging and thoughtful, and a wonderful interpretation of our Pope's new encyclical. I have a quick question. It's a little involved, but I'll just say it briefly as I can. We understand that Pope Francis, through groups like the Global Catholic Climate Movement, is going to initiate a divestiture campaign next year to remove all investments in carbon-based energy companies aimed internationally at all dioceses and parishes all around the world, and as well as other Catholic organizations and universities such as Christian Brothers University. How well will this global papal direct action be accepted by American bishops and cardinals? And do you anticipate your being able to engage the people of your diocese in this prophetic action?
Let me start with the last part of your question, because for me it's the most pertinent. In my region of Appalachia, we were a coal-based economy for a long time, and it's been a real tough sell for the people of that region to understand that coal is not coming back and that we need a different way of creating energy, and that there are better alternatives available. But I can fully appreciate the difficulty of doing that. At the same time, I recognize Pope Francis knows very well that unless we take some concrete actions and unless it costs us something to do it, we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to make progress. So I don't know any of the details about that other than what you've said about that initiative. I expect it'll be a hard sell. And the American church is not that familiar with the teachings of Pope Francis, despite leader of the Universal Church, and especially in the divisive partisan atmosphere in which we find ourselves. A lot of the mail I get calls him a communist and all the kinds of things that have been used against other visionaries and prophetic leaders in the past. So I think it's important that we wrestle with those questions, and I think we have to take some concrete action, and I think he knows well that it's got to hit the pocketbook. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, and good luck to you as you try to get your brother bishops to get behind this new movement. Thank you.
I'll try. Any other comments or questions? Is there anything in the chat room?
Let me ask a question.
Here comes Carmen, Father Carmen with a question.
Uh, I know just as a religious taking the vow of poverty, it is very difficult to talk to my brothers within the order or other orders about the need or the desirability of simplifying our lives. There is a sense that what the all of the luxuries or all of the convenience that we have are just part of what it means to live in the 21st century. And I wonder if you, Bishop Stowe, have any hope, and what is the basis of the hope, if you have it, of people kind of changing their way of thinking and changing their way of living. I suppose the changing living would come even before change of thinking, so that we may go into the future with a greater sense of solidarity with the peoples of well, for us, be the extreme parts of the world.
Again, I think that would be very difficult in our time and place. And I think one of the obstacles to that is, do we ever hear that from the pulpit? Do we ever hear a connection between our way of life and consumption and how to live the gospel? I think we've just accepted an American ethos, a consumption ethos, very uncritically as just who we are, like you said, being part of the 21st century. So when Francis talks in these encyclicals about conversion, he's not just talking about people out there, he's talking about those of us within the church as well, and having to think about the impact that what we eat and what we wear and what we purchase and how frequently we purchase and whether we recycle or not has a bearing on our spirituality, has a bearing on our putting the gospel into practice. But I don't think people are challenged on that very often. And maybe with good reason, that the preachers aren't willing to challenge themselves on that, so it would be hypocritical to challenge others. But where does it start? And then it's not just individual decisions, it's also, as we heard in the earlier question, about the corporate decisions, how we invest our resources and how we put that into practice. But I think what I said earlier about Pope Francis is trying to bring the social teaching of the church really to the heart and center of the church, rather than as a specialization that is kind of take it or leave it, or that's what some people do, or that's for the prophetic group, or it's a specialized group. Yes. Okay, so the question is about, for those who couldn't hear it, the question is about trying to find ways to overcome the hurdles in an American culture that would lead to this vision of Pope Francis. And the question is related to the prayers of the faithful and where they come from. So nobody is required to use any set of prayers of the faithful. There's a standard pattern that we pray for the Pope, we pray for the government leaders, we pray for the poor, but there are services that provide written ones. There are liturgy committees who do that themselves. There are a number of ways that people produce those. So some very practical suggestions that incorporating into the general intercessions phrases, teachings from the Catholic social teaching so that we're planting seeds and people hear it on a regular basis, using the parish bulletins that often have different things included in them to have some component of Catholic social teaching included there. And in the seminary preparation, that seminarians are trained when they're preaching to make sure to preach the social teaching of the church. I think it's the last one that would be the most effective. I think all of them are good ideas. I think the last one would be most effective. And it has been a frustration of mine that seminaries still present Catholic social teaching as kind of an afterthought. It's a required inclusion in the curriculum, but it's not given the attention that other areas of our teaching are. And I think Pope Francis points to the urgency of doing that. So those are very practical and common sense suggestions. You've probably been in the church long enough to know how common sense things take a lot of work to implement. I like that. Yes. So what are the practical steps that we can take in day-to-day life? I think the first thing Pope Francis would ask us to do is to have a consciousness of the stuff that I'm eating, the stuff that I'm wearing, the stuff that I'm buying. Where does it come from? Who's affected in this? Whose work brings this to me? Do I need as much as I need? So we talk about that personal thing, and then to break out, and it's more difficult to do during this time of pandemic, but he's always talking about the importance of encounters. So we have a period of racial tension and violence in the country, but most of us know people like ourselves and don't have the opportunities or don't make the opportunities to break out of those self-enclosed communities or groups that we come from, whether it's political persuasion, whether it's an approach to the gospel or spirituality, whether it's the church that we go to. So getting outside of our comfort zone, interacting with other people to recognize this fraternity, and then thinking about concretely what the choices that I make and what I can do with them. Not wasting food is one that Pope Francis brings about all the time. And individually, we don't think we're making much of an impact, but when you think about on a global scale how much food gets thrown away, it's quite the challenge. So all of us can do something.
So we do have a question in the chat. How can the poor not stay away from employment by polluting funds?
How can the poor not stay away from employment? Well, I could talk about in Appalachia, that's been a real dilemma. If there's no other alternative, if there's no other possibilities for employment, people end up working for companies that out of necessity. And I think when Pope Francis talks about that we have to sometimes make the choice of the lesser of two evils, and that might be all right for a while, but we still have to work for a bigger picture. But the poor don't have a lot of choices about where they work, especially if they're in areas of great unemployment, underemployment. They don't have a lot of choices. And I think Pope Francis says in both of those encyclicals, we often place burdens on the poor that are beyond what they can carry and want them to make up for the exploitation that they were not so much a part of. Yes, Father.
No question so much, Bishop, as this an observation in terms of folks' emphasis on conversion. Back in the late 60s, Bernard Lonergan was asked, what do you see with the growing disparity in the divide between the rich and the poor? And he said, all I can see is that has stuck with me over the years. How important that is to keep encouraging people to a greater generosity that they think.
Okay, so the comment was quoting the theologian Bernard Lonergan, asked about the growing divide between the rich and the poor, and how can we make it better? And his suggestion was transformative generosity. And that might be another of the practical things that each of us can do is how can we be generous? What can we give somebody else, whether it's time, whether it's resources, whatever it is. So transforming generosity. I think that's kind of like Francis's revolution of tenderness, as opposed to the globalization of indifference. when he first talked about the globalization of indifference, he asked, why is a change of 1 point in the stock market headline news and hundreds of people dying as they're trying to escape famine in Africa not worthy of the news? You know, that's that globalization of indifference. But the other side of that would be the kind of generosity that involves knowing their stories and recognizing their humanity.
Father, I want to say something, but do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
I want to say something, but I don't know where to start. Your talk was excellent, but being an African American living in America and what we've gone through for the past 4 years,
Yes.
I have really had a hard time staying Catholic because you go to church, I get nothing from the priest because he's trying to satisfy the white folks and not rock the boat. And I feel like I put my money into a church that doesn't give a hoot about me. And everything you're saying makes sense, but when you got people like Mitch McConnell, you got conservatives in the Supreme Court now and then you have had a president that we just had, it was all like, I don't know where I am at this point in terms of religion. I keep going to mass, going to communion, but I am really confused. I am very confused because what you're saying is good and it makes sense. And we know we're pretty much doomed if we keep on the way we're going. But are people really listening? Are they really listening to, you have a president that says, don't wear a mask. You have Mitch McConnell and people like that that don't even think that people deserve a healthcare system. But it's just, like I say, I feel like I'm losing my mind really, because everything you're saying is true, but as long as you have racism in this country, and really all over the world, I just can't see it getting any better. I really can't.
Thank you for stating it so boldly, and you make the case about our need for conversion. And you know, one of the reasons I admire Pope Francis so much is that despite all the pushback that he gets, he continues to be hopeful and he knows what humanity is capable of. And we've been through a very dark time, and I know the African American community has felt it a lot longer and a lot deeper than most of us. I hope that, you know, the demonstrations that we saw in the streets this past summer, with not just African Americans, but all people of different races coming together and marching, I hope that bears some impact. And I hope that we're moving into a more positive time when it comes to our government. But you're right, when people deny reality and deny the humanity, I think that's why Pope Francis emphasizes so much the dignity of the human person and the common good, that we are one family. How do we make people believe that? How do we make people act like it's real? That's the challenge in front of us. So I'm grateful that you have held on, because we need your, I know I have that discussion with the African American community in my own diocese pretty regularly. And I'm amazed at the depth of their faith and how they are able to stick with it and how they can teach the rest of us. And it's my responsibility and the responsibility of people in leadership to help bridge those gaps and to help people see the humanity of each other. But please don't give up. You're too important to what we should be doing, and call our attention to that. Leo's got another comment or question. I can't hear you. You got to unmute, Leo.
In light of what this lady just shared with us, which I certainly heard, part of our baptismal vows are to be prophets and priests, all of us, lay folk as well as clergy. And I just wonder, to what extent does the U.S. Conference of Bishops help bishops like yourself who weren't necessarily trained to be prophets or to help their layfolk, or importantly, their own priests in their diocese? What resources is the U.S. Conference of Bishops providing you as a bishop, tools and resources to uplift that prophetic dimension?
Well, the first example I can think of is the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. I think it's one of the greatest things that our church in the United States does. But unfortunately, it's a specialization for some people. It's not even something that's acknowledged in all dioceses. But we have the tools there. We have the great tradition there. I don't know if we have enough support for things like that. Catholic Relief Services is another great thing that we do on the global scale, and they've gone well beyond providing immediate relief after natural disasters, but working with local populations on how to rebuild their lives together, collectively, communally. So the resources are there. It's just in all the other demands that are part of our lives, and frankly, what we're comfortable with and what we choose to spend our time and energy on. That's where the need for conversion touches everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes. So another great suggestion from writing our congressional representatives and senators about, instead of throwing out the phrase, God bless America all the time, let's recognize God has blessed America. Let us be a blessing for others. And maybe that would change our way of thinking a little bit. I like it. Well, I thank you for your participation tonight. I'm glad to greet the folks from Pax Christi that are here from various places, and the local folks in Memphis, and some from Little Rock and other places. So delightful to be with you. Hope you come learn more about the Shrine of St. Martin de Porres and his own great example of the witness of St. Martin's life. Thank you.
Before we say goodnight, I'd like to just acknowledge the contribution of Christian Brothers University, and of course, the Christian Brothers in Memphis now for 150 years. The Christian Brothers University has co-sponsored this lecture, and we're very grateful for their hospitality. I also, just to say that tomorrow we have a second presentation by Bishop Stowe at 11 o'clock in the morning. We're going to have a discussion on racism. Bishop Stowe will introduce comments, and he'll be asking us to participate, much like Aileen did tonight. Thank you all for participating, especially you people who came here, but also those people who participated through Zoom. And again, thank you, Brother Patrick Conway and Christian Brothers University.
Thank you.